So today I'm going to try to start telling the story of my crazy kids and how I survived and how my wonderful mother helped me get through those very crazy years. Thank God we lived on the top floor of her house for 10 very happy years. Mama not only gave me life, she saved my life. And she saved the lives of my children who would run to her every time they got into trouble. And poor Mama and Papa lived downstairs, always to the rumble of these kids. Whatever they were getting into, all the noise would go downstairs. Poor Papa would say, "Shut up!" And Mama would say, "Shut up, they're your grandchildren." Wise old Mama. If it wasn't for her, I'd either be dead or in the crazy house today. She had the wisdom of Solomon, strong as a horse, and the courage of a lion. There was nobody like her. She was a woman illiterate in her native tongue and in English, but whenever I wanted advice or help or any kind of help, I went to Mama. To know her was to love her. Was always basically a very cheerful person, to the extent where her friends would say to her, "But Carmela, don't you have any troubles? You always smile." And she'd say, "You know what I do? Before I go out, I sweep all my troubles behind my kitchen door. When I come home, they're waiting for me." So she put on the happy face, and for that hour or few hours that she was out, she really would forget all her troubles, because she'd be with her sister or her friends. And then when she got home, she'd tend to whatever business, whatever work, whatever heartaches were waiting for her. But she rarely showed a sad face when she was outside. So Carmela was known as the lady with the smiling face, the lady who never had any troubles. She had her share of problems like any of her other friends or her sister, but she kept them at home, and then she'd face her problems when she got home. Cipollone, actually a very, very pretty mountainous village. I see it as very pretty. Mama hated it because to her Cipollone was poverty, and she was right to consider it poverty because she grew up in extreme poverty. My grandmother had 3 different sets of children. Her mother's name was Maria Donisi. When she married the first time, she had 2 children. Carmen and Maria were her 2 children by her first marriage. I don't know how long that husband was alive, but after he died, she married for the second time, and he came with 2 children. She married a widower who already had 2 children, and she had my mother. Antoinette. So my mother has no full siblings. They're all half-sisters and half-brothers. She had only Mama with her second husband. Unfortunately, he came to America. He went upstate. I think he was in Massachusetts or somewhere up north, and he got malaria for some reason, and he went home to die. My mother was only 5 years old.
This was his name was Carmen?
His name was Carmen, yeah. And Mama was only 5 years old when he died, so she would say, "I remember him like it was in a dream." The one thing she remembers about him, she'd always say, "My father was the richest man in the village," but how rich could he have been when he was the only one who could eat an egg for breakfast? She said, "And I was allowed to dip a little piece of my bread into his egg. I could dip into the egg yolk." And I said, "Well, Mama, how come you couldn't eat any eggs if you had chickens?" She said, "Well, we needed them to barter for other food." And he was supposed to be the richest man in the village, so you can only imagine the extreme poverty that most of the people were living in. She had one dress, and only one dress, which she would wear until it was in tatters or until she grew too big for it.
and there was a stream behind her house, and when nobody was around, she'd go behind the house, take off her dress, wash her dress in the stream, and then put it back on.
Wet?
Wet, when no one was around. No running water, no electricity. There was a well in the center of town where she'd go get the water and put a pot on her head, as little as she was, and walk home with a bucket of water on her head. And that's how they bathed and ate and drank. All the water they had to come from the well in the middle of the village.
Were they living in the castle at that time?
Yeah. She lived in this castle just for a few years. I don't know the house where she lived in before, but there was this big castle with about, I don't know, maybe 16, 18 apartments. And years later, when we went back to Italy together, we went right up to the door of the apartment where she was living as a young girl. And I'm sorry to this day that I didn't knock on the door and ask if I could go in and look around. It was only one room, but it would have been interesting to go in and see where Mama had grown up for a little while. And it was funny, when you went through the entrance of the castle, they still had these tremendous cobblestones. Nothing had changed about it, except that it had become a tenement, you know. It no longer belonged to a prince. It had belonged to the Prince of Cipollone. And over the centuries, it deteriorated into a tenement. But I would have loved to go inside and see the one room where she lived with her mother and her siblings and chickens walking around too, because the chickens were in there. And they had an outdoor oven. It was a community oven where all the women would go and bake their bread. But unchanged, except that it became multifamily, where one prince lived before it became like an apartment house.
So you're saying she lived there only a few years?
Only a few years.
Where'd they go from there?
Still in the village, but in the little house. These houses were like rabbit warrens, you know, all interlocking. You couldn't see where one started and the next one ended. But they were amazing houses because they're all of 300 or 400 years old. And when you go in, they're so cool because the walls are about 3 feet thick. My cousins still live there to this day. Imagine poor grandma raising a family after 2 husbands died. She's left with 5 children and no money. There was no welfare, no pension, no aids to widows. There was no money whatsoever. She had a plot of land that was hers, and she raised olives and made her own olive oil. She raised some wheat and took the wheat to the miller to be ground. She made sausage from the pigs that she raised. She had chickens and would barter the eggs for something else. And every once in a while she'd go to the nearest city. I don't know how big the city was, Benevento. And she'd have a pot of vegetables or eggs or sausages on her head. And my mother would go along with her and my aunt. And they would barter. Sometimes they'd make a few cents on eggs or whatever they're selling. And other times they would just trade. I'll give you this and you give me that. Sometimes she needed a few cents for some cloth to make some clothes or make an apron. And that was the way she would make a few cents. I can't even imagine trying to raise a family without a penny in your pocket. And she lived on the charity of relatives, whoever can afford to give her something. She had a very, very hard life.
Well, your mother had a miracle as a child, right? Didn't she have a coffin made for her?
Yeah. At the age of 8, she had Spanish influenza, where thousands and thousands of people died. And she was at the point of death. And in those days, the coffins were had to be built while you were dying, because in her little village anyway, you didn't go out and buy a coffin. The local carpenter would make you one, and it was her uncle who made her coffin. Her uncle, who was a carpenter,
made her coffin, but somehow Mama survived, and the coffin went to her best friend, who died at the time. My mother had this craving for knowledge, just like I did, that's right. Her grandmother made no effort to push her to school. She was really too young to make up her mind when she decided she wasn't going, and she didn't go, and Grandma didn't let her, didn't make her. But years later she said, "Quando sono stata stupida," how stupid I was. Ah, se sapesse leggere e scrivere. Oh, che facesse. Oh, if I only knew how to read and write. Oh, what I would accomplish. She says, first, I could drive a car. How am I going to drive a car if I can't read the signs, if I can't pass the licenza, get the license? Non tengo a licenza. Although my grandmother finished school. My grandmother was very bright and finished school, but when her two young daughters decided they didn't want to go, she didn't send them. But the rest of her life she was kicking herself because it would be a block to things that she wanted to do. She couldn't.
Did you ever meet your grandmother?
Yeah, she's the only grandparent I know. Eventually, my uncle, who was much older than my mother, came to America. I don't know where he got the money to come here, but he did come. And he later sent for Mama and her sister Antoinette and his mother, Maria. And she talked about coming over on the boat, which took a month on choppy ocean waters. And she loved to dance, and there was an accordion player. I think every one of the ships in those days had an accordion player. And she was always dancing, always doing the tarantella. And she tells me she got 2 proposals on the ship, men she had never known before. And one of them was wealthy. He was a shoemaker. A shoemaker was wealthy in that village, and he wanted when they landed to take her back on the return ship and take her back to the village. And she says, "Oh no, I'm going to America. I'm going to stay with my mother." And he pleaded. And she said he was a very nice young man who was wealthy because he was a shoemaker, but she had no interest in getting married because she was only 18. And even though they married young in those days, that was the furthest thing from Mama's mind. She was going to stay with her sister and her mother.
Who was the other guy?
I don't know who the other guy was. I only remember that this particular one, she'd say, "Enrico, he was rich. He was a shoemaker, and I could have had a good life in Italy." Then when she'd get mad at Papa, and they got mad often at each other, each one would tell the other one, "Too bad the ship didn't go down with you on it when you were coming to America." They detained her at Ellis Island because she was illiterate. Mama was detained not for lice or TB or any other stupid disease. She was detained because she was illiterate. She and her sister were behind barred windows, and they would yell all day long, "Carmina, Carmina, venima figlia, come and get us, come and get us. We're behind bars." They were detained for about a week, and he's the one that got the 3 of them here. Except that he took them to a little village in Jersey called South River, which I visited about 10 years ago. It's still a one-horse town. I think the main street is about 3 blocks long. And that's where Mama married Papa. She was married at City Hall. And we even visited City Hall. And the room where Mama had been married was now a jail. And we teased her about that. We said, "Mama, you married Papa in the local jail." No, they got shut down. It wasn't a jail then. I said, "But Mama, this is the room where you were married in, and it's now a jail." Joey took us on a trip to see where Mama lived, before she came to New York City, and she hated South River with a passion. She went to work for Michelin Tires, actually making the rubber tires, where the tires were being bathed in an acid wash. And Mama lasted exactly 1 week in that factory because her skin was raw and bleeding. She'd have to pull the tires out of the acid bath. And she hated America. She said, if this is America, I want to go back. Eventually, she got a job in a lace factory where most of the workers and the owner were Polish. So Mama thought she was learning to speak Polish or English, where in fact her first words other than Italian here were Polish. She thought she was learning English. Not so. Okay, Grandpa came here at the age of 19, being born in 1893, that would make it 1912 when he came. Having come in 1912 at the age of 19 would make Mama only 11 years old. So though he knew this little kid that he left behind in his village, she did not know him. The families knew each other, but Grandma does not remember Grandpa when she was a little girl. So by the time Grandma arrived with her sister, now they must have been 19 and 21. Mama must have been 19 and her sister 21. And like I said, they settled in New Jersey, where they lived with their brother and their mother. My father was living in the Bronx with his cousin, Emil. They didn't live together, but they both lived in the Bronx. And somehow, Emil started courting Antoinette. On the weekend, he would go to New Jersey and visit with this girl that he wanted to marry. And one day, he asked my father to go along with him for the day. And in those days, you used to take a train and then get on a ferry and then take the Lackawanna Railroad to get you where you wanted to go in Jersey. So evidently that's how my father and his cousin were traveling, because they never owned cars. Anyway, they got to visit my mother's house, and now my father sees this little village girl all grown up, and he fell in love with her. So he started dating Antoinette's sister. So now here are two cousins dating two sisters. So Aunt Evelyn and I are doubly related. Our fathers were cousins and our mothers were sisters. Now when I say courtship consisted of visiting the house where you sat on chairs. There were no living room furniture. And where everybody sat on chairs with the mother always in between. And occasionally, Grandpa took Grandma to a movie, and Grandma went along and Uncle Carmen went along, sitting in between Mama and Papa. That was their courtship. After a year of that, they got married, and Grandpa set up an apartment in the Bronx on Holland Avenue, not the house I was born in, but he got an apartment on Holland Avenue. He completely furnished it, down to the groceries in the cupboards, linens and everything. And he always said, Mama always said about Papa, he married me with the clothes on my back. In those days, if a girl didn't have a dowry, she couldn't marry, nobody would want her. So many sets of sheets and so many pots and what have you. It was required to get married. Grandma had none of that, because the little bit that Grandma had went to her first daughter. There was nothing left for Mama. And she'd always say, Papa married me with just the clothes on my back. And she always remembered when she walked in her first little apartment and saw everything that she needed in that house. And she was very grateful for that. Another thing about Papa, I knew nothing about his mother, my paternal grandmother. He never once ever mentioned her name when we were growing up. One day I'm sitting in his kitchen, we're having coffee, and I said, Papa, what was your mother's name? And how did she die? We know nothing about her. and he started to talk, and as he spoke, he was crying. He said, my mother's name was Josephine, and she died in childbirth. Up till then, we knew nothing about this. At least I didn't. He said, my father had 4 sons, and my mother was pregnant, and she had twins. He said, my father came in from the fields to help deliver the babies because all the women had their babies at home with a midwife. He said, my mother delivered a set of twin boys, so there were now 6 boys in this family. And my grandfather went back in the fields to finish his planting. When he came home that evening before dark, he found his wife dead in bed, her head hanging over the side of the bed, and the 2 babies alive in the bed alongside her. She had hemorrhaged to death after he'd gone back to work. And the babies survived for 2 more days and then died of starvation because there was nobody to feed them. And he said his father gathered them around, his 4 young sons. Papa was only 11 at the time. He was the 2nd youngest, and evidently he was the frailest of the 4. And he told the children, I will not give you a hard life, so I am not going to marry again, and you might get a stepmother who might abuse you. He said, so I'm going to remain single. And he said to Papa, you will become the woman of the house. You will cook and you will clean while your brothers help me in the farm. And that's how it was. At the age of 11, Papa taught himself to clean and taught himself to cook. And little by little, he became an incredible cook. But there was nobody there to tell him when he was making a mistake or something was too salty or undercooked. Papa learned on his own. And years later, he was so good that he taught Mama to cook, it was unusual that this young Italian bride didn't know how to cook. But Mama was the baby in her family, so she never had to do very much. So Papa took her under his wings, and he made her an incredible cook, as you kids all know.
Because my parents were very advanced for old-fashioned Italian Catholics. We were named after no one. My parents gave us the names that they liked. I never liked Angelo or Carmela, and we could have been, although my first sister who died was named Carmela after my mother. But then when I came along, my father was walking through Pelham Parkway, and he heard a woman calling her daughter. And he said, I like that name, Eleanor. My mother was pregnant. He said, if this baby is a girl, we will call her Eleanor. And my mother wanted to call me Regina, which means queen. But Papa said, no, I like Eleanor, and we'll call her Eleanor. My brother Joe was named after nobody. When my brother Jim came along, the priest at the time was drunk. When we went in to get him baptized, he said, I'm baptizing this baby Jacob. And my father says, like hell you are. He said, Vincenzo, it'll be Jim. No, Jacob. Papa had a fight with him, and rightfully so. But we were given names that they liked. When Clara was born, there was a very popular Italian actress named Clara Stella, which means Clara Star. And I think she was named after this movie star, Clara Stella. And then Lena, just because they liked Lena, although Mama told me years later that he wanted to name Lena after an old girlfriend of his. He wanted to name her Millie. And Mama says, like hell, you're going to name her after an old girlfriend? We're calling her Lena.
3 of the houses we lived in were all on Holland Avenue. I don't remember the address of the house I was born in, but I remember where it was situated. On Holland Avenue, a few doors up from the house that we eventually bought. Oh, by the way, my mother describes my birth as the most horrendous thing she ever lived through. I was 15 pounds, the biggest of the bunch,
and she would describe the delivery as being, the only thing they didn't do to me was put me on a meat rack. She said she felt like a hunk of beef hanging on a meat rack because the midwife, she said I was so big I couldn't come out, so the midwife put her arm all the way up into my mother's abdomen and literally pulled me out. She said, and I was left like a piece of meat hanging on a butcher's meat rack. So much for my birth. They were all home births with Papa assisting the midwife. Okay, so that was in this little house on Holland Avenue where we lived till I was about 4. And then we moved further up Holland Avenue to a tenement up on the 4th floor. I talked about that when Mama had to climb through the window because she was locked out. Anyway, so that was our second house on Holland Avenue. Then around the corner on 215th Street to another little house, 768. I remember that address, 768 East 215th Street. And we were very happy there for about 5 years. But of course, you know, kids sometimes making noise, sometimes fighting with other little kids, little frictions here and there, but nothing really terrible. And this was during the Depression years. And I always remember her kindness. In those days, there were many poor men walking the streets begging for money and food. And they'd knock on Mama's door. She never had money to give them. But she'd say, you hungry? Wait to hear. And she'd go in and she'd bake big loaves of bread. They were too big to fit in our kitchen stove. And she'd bring them to the baker up the street to bake. And not knowing how to put her name on a piece of paper because she was illiterate, she'd stick a ziti in the dough. That was her mark. That was Camilla's bread. So she had this big loaf of bread, and she'd cut slices like this, always with the knife coming towards her. 2 huge slices of bread, and fill it with salami and tomatoes, and a glass of wine, and she'd bring it to the poor man who was begging for food. We were also poor, but Papa was working full time, so in her eyes we had a lot to give, and she always fed whoever came to the door. Never able to give them money, but she always shared whatever she had. And she'd always say, the more I give away, the more God lets it grow on my table. And I never forgot that. And I remember the bread lines and the people waiting online to get the government issue of peanut butter and cheese and milk. I remember the dry milk. I also remember when milk wasn't sold in bottles, it was in big tubs, like old-fashioned milk cans. And we would go there with a bucket, and the milk would be scooped out of a big milk can. Can you imagine buying milk like that today? And I remember when the ziti that we buy today, Ranzoni ziti, was sold loose, and the zitis were this long, and we would buy them this long. We'd ask for £1, and the grocer would put it on a big scale, and then it was my job on Sunday morning to sit at the kitchen table and break the ziti into 2-inch pieces. And it was tough work because they're very hard, you know, it's like breaking a stick. And Mama would say, Rombi ziti, break the ziti. And I would sit there with these long zitis like this, breaking them, getting them ready to cook. When the movies of the Little Rascals were being made, that whole scenario came back to me, you know, the dirt streets, the homemade wagons and scooters, the boys with their knickers and caps on, the girls with big banana curls and a big bow in their hair, because I had the big bow and the curls too. Mama would put a hot curling iron over the open flame of the stove, and then she'd curl my hair, but she'd leave the iron on too long and my hair smelled like burnt feathers. It was horrible, but I looked very pretty with the short dresses and the great big bow. And my mother made my underwear from flour sacking. Not very comfortable, but It covered what was important. Where she made me a skirt out of flour sacking. And I was in the color guard at school, and I was so proud. And it was such a botched up job. As young as I was, I knew it was pretty lousy looking, but I marched down the aisle behind the flag, and I was very happy to do it. I might have been maybe 7 or 8 years old in my flour sacking skirt and my flour sacking underwear. And under my blouse was a knit sweater, because we were supposed to keep very warm. And Mama would knit these itchy woolen sweaters. Actually, they were like little vests. And the teachers knew that a lot of the Italian kids had sweaters under their blouses, and they would pick up our shirts and tell us we weren't supposed to wear the sweaters under our blouses because the schools were warm. But Mama insisted that we had to wear them because our house was cold, because we lived in this cold water flat. So an itchy sweater under the blouse, flour sacking bloomers, and flour sack skirt.
And in 1937, I often wondered how Papa was ever able to buy a house. And then I remembered that about 1937, he finally got his bonus from the First World War. I didn't realize it was such a big bonus, big for those days anyway. The government sent him a check for $5,000. And I remember he was so happy that the day after the mailman delivered the check, my father had a bunch of cigars and gave it to the mailman as a gift. He was so overjoyed. And with that $5,000 bonus, he put the down payment on the house that he bought again on Holland Avenue. So now, again, we were going to live only 2 doors away from the house where I was born, which was 3534 Holland Avenue. In fact, when you think back, life was charming then. Simple more than charming, simple. We weren't sophisticated. We were happy with our lot. We didn't know any better. We didn't realize we were poor. Life was extremely simple. All you worried about was if you were going to make it to the next payday, which wasn't very much for starters, but we always did make it to the next payday. We never went on home relief, which to Papa was such a disgrace. But some of the things I remember, men would come around with all different kinds of services to offer you. There was the knife sharpener, who had this big wheel. Well, it looked like sandpaper, but obviously it was more than sandpaper. It was a humongous wheel where he would grind the knives and the scissors, maybe for 10 cents or 15 cents a piece, according to how big the knife or the scissor was. Fruit peddlers came by every day. Each man seemed to have his own route. I guess they didn't intrude on other men's routes, but all fresh vegetables. Some men came by just selling tripe, which stunk like hell. Then there was the organ grinder, who would go around making tunes, and Mama would throw a nickel down or a penny down, whatever loose change she could afford. Then there was the one with the parrot, who would tell you your fortune, and he had this box, sort of like the boxes that hold all the little videotapes, and the parrot, at his command, would bend down and pick up a card in his mouth, and he would tell a fortuna. It would be written in Italian, and Mama would either smile or be horrified according to whatever was written on that little card, and it might have cost a few cents. Then there was the musician, if you want to call him that, who would come around with a monkey, and he had this contraption. A drum was tied on his back, and he had cymbals on his feet, and a monkey in one arm, and he'd kind of stamp his feet, and the cymbals would play, and the drum would be banging on his back. I don't know how he put that contraption together, but it was like a one-man band. And when you heard him, you'd look out the window and you'd throw him a few pennies, and I guess that's the way that this man made his money, from the women dropping coins.
Oh, and the ice being delivered on the truck. Ice was 10 cents a block, and you bought it every couple of days depending on how hot it was and how fast the ice would melt. But anyway, they always knew when to come around, and Mama would call out for 10 cents worth, and this big block of ice would be in this old ice box in the kitchen, and it was my job to empty out the dish of water. There was a big enamel basement underneath. I had to be careful not to spill it and dump it into the sink. A lot of food went sour those days because obviously the chunk of ice wasn't enough, but that's all we could get. But as soon as Papa could afford it, it was maybe a year or two after he bought the house, that he bought his first GE refrigerator. Everything had to be GE. Papa thought there was nothing better than General Electric. I remember when we got our radio, it was a big console, and we all had to sit up against it. Not that we couldn't hear it, but that was the thing to do. The way kids are glued to the TV today or their video games, we were glued to the radio. And Mama would put it on full blast, where you could hear it a block away, and she'd sing along. She would only turn to the Italian stations, but that's okay because we understood Italian. And she'd sing at the top of her lungs, always out of tune, but she loved to sing. And Papa, of course, had to hear the news. And she loved music. I might have been, I'm not sure, maybe 7 or 8 years old before we got our first radio. Before that, we had a wind-up Victrola that you wound up by hand, and it played these big old records. And we had a lot of Caruso records, and she'd sing along with them. But every time you wanted music, you'd have to crank up this old Victrola. So then my father bought our first radio, and it was a big thing, a big console radio. Probably didn't have very good tone, but Mama would turn it on first thing in the morning, and she'd sing as loud as she could. So we knew all the Italian songs when we were young, because she'd sing and then we learned to sing along with her. She had a big love of music, no voice whatsoever. She loved to sing off key, and we sang with her. Very pretty, always was, and very popular. Her house was always the center of everything that was going on. Not that very much went on, but if they were going to congregate, it was always in our house. I would come home and I would smell coffee out in the hall, and I'd say, I wonder who's here today. And it would be either her sister or a friend, or her sister and her friend. My house was always the center of attention because Mama was very outgoing, very hospitable, and best of all, Mama knew how to keep secrets. So people always confided in her if they were having money trouble, or husband trouble, or children trouble. They'd start by saying, Carmela, I know you know how to keep your mouth shut, so I want to tell you something. And it was funny because next door there were 2 sister-in-laws who lived in the same house, and they couldn't stand each other, and they were always bickering, and they were called Rena and Lena. So Rena would come over and complain about Lena, and then Lena would come over and complain about Rena, and then they'd give Mama the 3rd degree. And I know Rena said this to you. And Mama would say, I don't know nothing, I don't know nothing, I don't listen to nothing. And then the other one would come, and I know Lena said this to you to complain about, no, I know nothing. So Mama knew how to keep her mouth shut. Everybody would confide in her, and the house was always full of people. Like I said, one of my favorite aromas that I remember so well was the smell of percolating coffee that I would smell in the outside hall. And to this day, percolating coffee is my favorite beverage. Don't give me the coffee machine because there's not that wonderful, welcoming aroma. To me, coffee meant come in and sit a while. To this day. Mama had a wonderful, marvelous, unbelievable religious experience one day. And she told us about it as soon as we woke up in the morning. We were very young. I
I don't know, maybe 11 or 12 years old. Jimmy was a very, very sick boy, sick to the point where none of us expected him to live. He had very, very bad asthma, and I remember many nights when I would hear him coughing and I would get up and my brother Joey would get up and Jimmy would be gasping for air and Mom and Papa unable to do anything for him. Eventually the doctor gave him some powder, which I believe was marijuana. In fact, I know it was marijuana because he said if Jimmy were an older boy, he could smoke this in a cigarette. But since he was so young, he was being given this powder where we would have to light it. Mama would put a tablespoon or two in a metal plate. I still remember that little metal dish where one of us would go in the bathroom with him, and I often went in with him if my mother was busy or my father was busy. And we would light it, and Jimmy would have to inhale it, and he would get relief from his asthma attacks. And we really, really expected Jimmy to die very young. But one day my mother went to bed, and she got up. I don't know if it's because she was worried or Jimmy had had an attack. And she was sitting on the side of the bed, and she said Mother Cabrini came to her in person as she sat by the side of the bed. This was when Jimmy was at his worst. And she said Mother Cabrini approached her and said, "Do not worry about your son. He will be well when he is 13 years old. The asthma will leave him." This was a few years before it left. And at the age of 13, the asthma left my brother. Mama told us about this vision as soon as we were awake in the morning. She told Papa and she told all of us. Not only did she tell us that day, but through the years she always repeated that story. Mother Cabrini cured my son. She did as she promised when Jim was 13.
And
There was no trace of asthma.
who is Mother Cabrini?
A woman that was made a saint by the Pope, an American saint. There are hospitals named after her and schools. And my mother used to pray to her for a miracle. And she did perform that miracle. Fortunately, nobody in our family was killed. But the news was so horrendous. And every day when the Italian news came on, we couldn't say one word in the house. My father's ears were glued to the Italian news station because he had to be up on all the latest horrors that were happening. And I remember him many times sitting there crying as another ship went down and another city was being bombed. It was just a horror. And he lived it. He lived every minute of it. And one wonderful thing happened at the end of the war. Everybody was having these big block parties, and Holland Avenue had one of the best block parties I ever saw in my life. Everybody was out in the street till late at night. Lights were strung up from house to house, and people were partying and laughing and singing and drinking till the early hours of the morning. And my father was right up there with the best of them. He drank himself blind that night. The one time in my life that I saw my father dead drunk. He was so overcome with joy, and he let it all hang out, dancing and singing. And then he went inside and threw up all over the house because he had drank so much. But it was just a night of pure joy. The war was over, and the boys were coming home. And my brothers were safe.
And what were your brothers doing in the service?
Joey was in England at the time,
Jimmy was in the States on a light ship, which he hated, but he volunteered to go in the Coast Guard, and he was on a light ship where he didn't set foot on land for 2 months at a time.
Mama didn't approve of Nick. When I met him, he was a sailor, and she says, "You crazy, you marry a sailor today with you, tomorrow with somebody else." And as you well know, I married him, and years later I said to Mama, "You never liked Nick when I met him because he was a sailor." "Oh, no, I don't say that. Mama, you didn't like sailors." "No, no, for l'amor di, for the love of God, I love a Nick, I love a Nick." I said, "Yeah, but not when he was in uniform." So we had a few laughs over that. Now, Mama didn't speak much English or understand much English until the day my brother came home with an English war bride. And it really took off from there. It was one comedy of errors after another. Noreen didn't know a word of Italian, and Mama barely knew any English. And we would all go off to work or to school, and these two women would be left totally alone, with Noreen always by her side, watching Mama cook and how she cleaned her house, but hardly understanding a word the other one said. A few days after she came, she said to Mama, "Mother, I'd like a bath." And Mama said, "Ah, che dici? What are you saying?" "Mother, I'd like to take a bath." "Ma che cazzo dici questa figliola?" And she was getting angry and no stand, no stand. And she took Mama by the hand and took her to the bathroom. She said, "I'd like to have a bath." "Oh, well, bagno, va piglio un bagno, go take your bath if that's what you want." And Noreen she wanted to ask permission if she could use the bathtub, but that's how they were trying to communicate. Her and her thick English accent, and Mama not understanding a word.
Where were they living at the time?
On Holland Avenue, in the apartment where we eventually lived with our 6 kids. So now here's Mama stranded with this English daughter-in-law, trying to communicate every day, just the two of them. So we had a fruit peddler. We had a lot of fruit peddlers in those days. And they hawked their wares out on the street, and they'd call up, and the women would hear, and they'd go down and buy their vegetables. So Mama would go down, and she'd buy for Noreen too, and she'd yell up to the second floor, "Noreen, you want a tomato, son?" Tomatoes became tomatoes. Mama's brand of English. "You want a tomato, son? Or you need a potato, son?" That was her word for potatoes. And Noreen would either answer yes, or "I don't need it, Mother." And Mama would buy, according to what Noreen would tell her. On Sundays, when Mama was headed off to church, "Noreen, you want to come to church?" So church became church. In fact, even little Dorothy, my little niece who had come at 6 months old, when she was old enough to start speaking, she spoke Carmelese. She'd say, "My daddy goes to work, and I go to church with him." Little Dorothy, 2 or 3 years old. "My daddy goes to work, and I go to church." We married. We went to Kansas for 2 years. And then when we came back to New York, we moved into Mama's house. One of the best moves we ever made. We lived for 8 months in the basement with 2 little babies, Linda and Marianne. Then Uncle Joe moved out upstairs, and we moved upstairs, where we lived for 10 years. The twins were born. We moved up in January of '53, and in May, the twins were born. And then started a very happy, very frantic part of my life. Happy in that I was happy with my children, planned and unplanned, and we were living in Mama's house. We spent 10 very happy years there. Any other mother, I think, would have been pulling her hair out with all the work that she was doing to help us, but I bless her every day of my life for what she did. She'd leave my father downstairs at 7 in the morning and come up and bathe her babies. Till the day she died, the twins were her babies, her very special babies. And Papa would be yelling upstairs, Carmina, buonas a mangia, when am I having my breakfast? Shut up by helping your daughter. Shut up by helping your daughter. She knew when to stand up to him. Unfortunately, there were years when she was afraid to open her mouth, but not when it came to me and my kids. Shut up by helping your daughter. Notice mother started to speak a language of her own. Not quite Italian and not quite English, so we would call her language Carmelese. It evolved into a language of her own, to the point where shortly before she died, about a year before she died, she had the Italian newscaster on TV, which I was listening to and understood. And she said to me, are they speaking Italian? And I said, yes, Mom, they're speaking Italian. She didn't understand one word of what the newscaster was saying, whereas I did. And I said, Ma, so Italiana. And what do you want from me, a Americana woman? So we called Mama's language Carmelese. Since her name was Camilla, Carmelese. Mama spoke her own brand of English. And when Papa was still alive, he would laugh at the way she would express herself. And, but do you know what you said? Shut up, but they stand to me. They stand to me. And it was really funny to listen to her, because she really thought she was speaking English. She was operated on once, and she, the day after the operation, she was full of gas, and she was expelling this gas. And just at that moment, a nurse came in, and she's sniffing the air. The gas, I guess, smelled terribly. We weren't there yet. And she's sniffing the air. And what she wanted to say to the nurse was, do you smell something? Where in fact she said, Noise, you stink. No, lady, you stink. She just had her own quaint, funny way of expressing herself. And it was Christmas Eve. We were sitting in Mama's kitchen, and she was going to cook her traditional Italian meal, Christmas Eve meal, which in those days was primarily fish and pasta. We really, we used to fast. There was no meat, and Mama was going to make calamari. She knew that the English word for calamari was octopus. We're sitting at the table. Dad is sitting between me and Mama. And Mama turns to Nick and she said, Nick, you know what I cook tonight? And he says, no, Mama, what are you going to cook? I'm going to make a hot pussy. Poor Dad is blushing. I leaned over to Mama and I said to her, Mama, do you know what you just said? You're going to cook a hot tobacco pouch. Oh, Gesù Cristo mio! Oh, Gesù. But her word for the female gender was tobacco pouch in Italian. And the word for the male was brother, which brings to mind another funny story. Many years later, Clara married her second husband, named Frank. One day, she and Frank were going to go to New Jersey to see Frank's brother. So Mama calls me up and says, today I'm going to see Frank's brother. I said, pig, Mommy, pig. What do you mean you're going to see Frank's brother? Yeah, we said, Ma, what do you mean you're going to see Frank's brother? You are a... Oh, no, Gesù. I don't mean Frank's brother. I mean Frank's brother in New Jersey. Clara and I were laughing so hard.
She learned what blue plate meant, because we'd say, Mom, tonight we're going to have blue plate. And there again, she didn't think that was a proper meal. She thought only a one-dish meal like stew or soup or a big pot of greens is what would fill you up. And she would tell me, Don't give your husband a playpen. Playpen was her word for blue plate. Somehow she couldn't remember blue plate, so it would come out, no, make a playpen, make a nicer biata soup. I said, Ma, playpen fills you up too. No, 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 nicer biata soup. She once saw a trailer going by the house. Oh, look, 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 a house a walk in the street, house a walk in the street. That was her word for trailer. And then she knew all the popular singers, and she loved them all. She'd hum along with them, but she never knew their names. Tom Jones was her favorite. Inglese, the Englishman. Inglese, oh, I like a hymn. That was Tom Jones. John Denver, she also liked. Oh, Germanese, the German. She couldn't know the name John Denver. Barbara Streisand was the Jew. Nat King Cole was the black. The one name she remembered was Harry Belafonte. That she remembered. She knew quite a few of the singers, but she didn't know one of them by name except Harry Belafonte. Oh, yeah. She saw Barefoot in the park. She came home and she says, Papa taking me to the movies. I see walk in the park and no shoes. Very good, Mama. Very good. Walk in the park and no shoes. And he always saw the babies first because I was recuperating from another cesarean where a zipper should have been put in. Mama would always say to me, why you no put a zip in there, up and down? Take them off everything. Oh, yeah. Her word for a hysterectomy, take them off everything. I say, Ma, it's a sin. God will punish me. Don't talk like that. I'm a Catholic, no cesarean. Take them off everything. It's a sin to have so many babies. How are you going to afford all of these babies? It's a sin. No, Ma, it's a sin what you're saying. God will take all my children away from me if I take them off everything. She was her own person, and she was way ahead of her time. I often wonder what she could have accomplished in her life if she had any education. She never attended school a day in her life, but she was also a philosopher. She would think about life and come out with some expressions, and I'd say, Ma, how can you even think this way? Things I never would have thought of another time, just walking along, out of the blue. What are we upon this earth? We're really nothing. We're here a few seconds, and then we die. We're nothing here. And then she'd say to me, why did I have to change my name when I got married? Penna is a good name. Why did I have to become an Izzillo? I would rather have stayed a Penna. Penna's a good name. By the way, Penna means feather. And she always argued with Papa because he'd say, my name is Angelo, which means angel. You're just a feather. A feather is better than an angel. She had answers for everything. A feather is better than an angel. No, you're just a feather. But that feather is better than you, Angelo. She was a woman's libber long before I even heard the expression women's lib. When Mama took her one and only trip back to Italy with Papa in 1960, Padre Pio was still alive, a man, a very saintly man, in the same league I would put with Mother Teresa, who the whole world knows about today, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was preaching there and he was going to hear confessions, and thousands of pilgrims, Mama included, Mama and Papa, climbing the mountain, trying to get close enough to him to speak to him. And it didn't happen that day, much to Mama's disappointment, but she got close enough to be talking to him from where she was standing, and from a distance, she said he looked at her and he raised his hand in a blessing. He made the sign of a cross and he blessed her, and I assume people that were near her, but she said at the moment it happened, there was such a perfume of flowers like she had never smelled in her life. And there were no flowers around her.
But in his biography, it is written that when you are in his presence, people who believed in him would get that aroma. They'd say this. There's a perfume surrounding this man like flowers, and Mama smelled that when she saw him while he was giving a blessing. She couldn't read about this. She had never heard about it, but this is what she told us when she came home from her trip, that she had smelled wonderful flowers like she never smelled before. And we said, Mama, people who see him, who believe in him, also smell. And she was amazed. She did not read it, but it happened to her. By the time Lisa was born, the walls should have been made of rubber because there was no room for us anymore in Mama's house. We had spent 10 wonderful years there, but I had 4 bunk beds in one room, a crib in my room, and Butch in the 3rd room, and there were no closets to speak of. I think there were just 2 closets in that whole apartment, and small ones at that. There wasn't room for us to move. So one day I broke Mama's heart by saying, Mama, we have to move. I said, there's no room for us anymore. I think secretly my father was happy because all the noise was going to leave with us. Although he loved us, but I think Papa was a little happy about us leaving. So poor Mama couldn't even talk about it. She says, I'm losing these babies. I said, Mama, it's only across town, it's only Riverdale, you'll still see us. But I made the decision, we had to move, and move we did. Though I had left Mama's house, it was always Mama who came to Riverdale, not only just about every week, but every time I was having a baby. She'd move in without Papa, she'd leave him behind and take over the household and cook and clean and send the children off to school and still find time to visit me in the hospital. She was the most incredible woman, the most incredible mother anybody could have had. She'd take 2 buses to get to my house and take over.
In fact, the kids loved having her here because she wasn't the tyrant mother like I had to be. She was an indulging grandmother, and she loved taking care of her grandchildren. So it was always Mama, and sometimes my sister. It was funny though, when Linda was dating Louis, he was showering her with wonderful gifts. He was very generous, and he always took her to nice restaurants, and he'd buy her jewelry and flowers. And Mama started to wonder, and she'd say, hey, where does he get all the money for this? Is he in the malavita? Is he in the mafiosa? Where does he get all the money to buy Linda all these wonderful gifts? And I said, Mama, he worked. He's got a good job. What do you mean, good job? Doesn't he go to school? I said, Mama, he's 25 years old. He's an Army veteran. He graduated, oh, I thought he was 17, 18. And she actually thought he was crooked because he was a young kid, and where was he getting all this money? Papa died in 78, but I'm very happy that he lived to celebrate his 50th anniversary, which was in 1972, February of 1972. And it was a wonderful party. And they sat up there so proudly. Papa was in a tuxedo with a blue ruffled shirt, proud as a peacock. And they had the original maid of honor and best man, which was my Uncle Carmen and her brother and sister, actually. Her brother Carmen and her sister Antoinette were on the dais, all in their gowns, and they were so proud, and we had a wonderful time because all the grandchildren were there, and we just had a ball. So we were very happy that they got to celebrate their 50th. Now this was 1972, and they had a couple of good more years, and then Papa died in 78, and we got him to the hospital, and sure enough, he had had a stroke. He lasted about 1 week. The last few days he went into a coma, and in 1978, April 14th, 1978, Papa died. So we decided to put the house up for sale. It had to be sold. First of all, Mama, even if she wanted to stay there, couldn't stay. She's illiterate. She couldn't read any bills that came in. She couldn't sign any papers. Anyway, the best thing to do was to sell the house. And we sold the house. But before we sold it, she told us, when I get my money from the house, are we all going to go to Italy? I take you and Claudia to Italy. And I said, Mama, I can't go. I've got a husband and kids. You no go, I no go. We all go to Italy. And I'm glad I listened to her because we went. But anyway, the house was sold. And Clara, Mama, and I went off to Italy for 1 month. It was incredible. We had so many laughs. Joey kind of mapped out a plan for us, told us where to go, and we pretty much followed his plan. And by bus and by cab, we went up and down the length of Italy, having a ball, laughing all the way. And at that time, when we were there, a very popular song was "Mi scappa la pipì," Papa, I have to go pee. And we would sing it at the top of our lungs everywhere we went, and people would laugh at us. We were like a couple of kids, and I couldn't believe it was happening. We got to see some of the relatives, and it was just wonderful. We had a ball. Mama saw her sister, who was still alive at the time.
Which sister was that?
Teresa, Mama's half-sister, who was so much like Mama in every way. Pretty like her, and same warmth, a beautiful, beautiful lady. They treated us like royalty. We stayed with her for 2 days. And she says, why don't you stay longer? But we wanted to get around and see as much of Italy as we could. And we did.
So, yeah.
Even though she was widowed relatively young, because she outlived Papa by 17 years, it was sad, and yet they were good times for her, because now she had all the independence she wanted, adoring children all around her. My brother would take her to his house, and Lee would take her to her house, and she was having a ball. She'd say, every day is Sunday, because there was nobody to restrict her anymore. It was all good times. And especially that Clara was divorced, so she didn't have to rush home to cook and clean for any man. I had a husband who was working most of the day, wasn't home till 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. So every morning we'd get up, either I would call Clara or she'd call me, and we'd say, what should we do today? And sometimes we'd go up to Connecticut, sometimes out to the beach, or to a movie, or just go out and eat. Mama was having a ball. She had the kind of life she was wishing for all her life. Enough money to enjoy herself, indulge herself in whatever she wanted to do, and 2 kids to take her wherever she wanted to go. I don't drive, but I went along for the ride, and we had wonderful, wonderful times. Movies, restaurants, visiting relatives. We were like 3 teenagers. It sounds funny. Here we were, 2 middle-aged women, an old mother, and having a ball, and it was wonderful. So those 17 years, well, almost 17 years, not at the last year or 2 were rough on Mama because she got very infirm. But I'd say she had a good 15 years of indulging herself. And one of her passions was to go in a store and pick out a suit or a blouse or something for us. Hey, I pay. I buy for you. I pay. It's a nice, and this is for you. And it was wonderful. She was like a little kid in a candy store, having a wonderful time. And I'm grateful for that.
How did she learn to read?
She taught herself very slowly, almost word by word. I think occasionally my father would help her. She learned to read the Bible, and I knew that she was reading because it would take her a long time to get through one story, and then she would repeat the stories to us. And I said, Ma, it's amazing. I said, you're learning to read. You never went to school, and you're teaching yourself to read. Because she had that desire. She had a hunger to learn. It came late in life, but it did come. And as the children were growing up, she had more time. She wasn't busy 18 hours a day making her own bread and her own macaroni and everything else from scratch. So she had the time to sit down with a book and taught herself to read and understood. I find myself these days praying in English the way Mama was praying in Italian. She had a wonderful, very short prayer when something was so horrendous, either in the world, in Europe, or in the United States, some horror story that she would hear, and she'd say, Dia, mette la mano d'oia. God, put your hand on this. But as I was standing by that desk, one of the nurses said to me, your mother is such a beautiful lady. We've never had another patient like her. Any little thing we do for her, if it's just a glass of water or take her to the bathroom, thank you, God bless. Thank you, God bless. And almost with her last breath, she was still saying that. Thank you, God bless. Very grateful for all the care that she was given. When we'd go visit her, thank you, God bless. She was a tough lady, but also a very, very loving, very grateful for any little thing that was done for her. And she always showed her appreciation, all, right to the very end. We never had another patient like your mother.
Dorothy who started the Bibby?
Yeah. Now, in our family, the pet name for Aunt was Bibby. And Dorothy started this because the word for aunt is Sia. If you were really affectionate, Sia, you'd hug, you'd kiss. But the word for aunt was Sia. Dorothy could not say Sia. So when my aunt, Antoinette, would come over, she'd say, Bibby, Bibby. Could not say Sia. And Dorothy started the tradition of calling everybody Bibby. As each new child comes along, we give them a preference. Do you want to be called Aunt? Do you want to be called Bibby? I'll be a Bibby. I'll be a Bibby. And the custom continues. But that custom goes back 50 years. Some of my children's friends would say to them, what's a Bibby? And they'd ask, what's the matter with you? Don't you know any better? That's my aunt. Well, why are you calling her Bibby? And then we'd go into this whole new spiel. It's Bibby because my young cousin couldn't say Sia.